Hello, and welcome to
Conway's Kitchen is some finger licking. It's an easy way to cook.
What is up, y'all? Welcome to Conway's Kitchen. Today we're going to be making nachos. I made these the other day. I thought they were super fire, so I figured make them for you all, show you how I go about it. Simple ingredients, super easy process, and pretty adaptable. You can kind of make it healthier or less healthy depending on what you want to do with it. There's a couple optional ingredients here like the jalapeno, vegetable broth, and the eggs, which you can add or you can not add. If you don't have them, you want to stay away from the spice. However you want to make it, you can make some bomb-ass nachos. Let's check it out. Alright, everything for nachos here, mise en place, everything in order, everything ready. We're going to start with a little saute of some onions, garlic and jalapenos, tofu, and then peppers. So let's get the heat going to about medium here. Add a liberal amount of olive oil to your pan. Tofu will absorb a lot of olive oil, so feel free to go for it. Onion here, we're going to use about half of this onion. And today, I want to talk about cutting down an onion in a somewhat interesting way. It can be kind of time consuming and it can seem maybe a little pointless to some, but it's a fun, interesting way to cut down an onion that I didn't quite think of until I started working in food service. With our onion here, you want to leave the butt end of it on. And basically we are going to be making horizontal cuts here across, but not all the way through. That's why we left this butt on, is you want to cut basically until about right here, and then you're going to slice it vertically, and then you turn it back again and you cut it one more time, and everything just falls apart into a perfect little dice there. So we have our paper towel underneath our cutting board here, a little wet paper towel just to make sure it's not sliding too much. And just start making strips here. Having a sharp knife will help make everything a bit safer for this process. My knife is not super sharp, so I'm going to be very careful about what I'm doing. And again, you're going through, but you don't want to cut all the way through. See, there's still connection here, there's still connection here. If you do cut all the way through, it's not a big deal. It happens. And there's more ways, or more onions to cut in the future. So we have 3 horizontal cuts, and then we're just going to do vertical little slits here. Again, not all the way to the back. You want to leave this back part connected, and you kind of want to keep the onion as intact as you can as you cut it, because we got horizontal, we got the vertical. Now you just turn it again, and you'll have your dice here, and you just cut down, and all the onion will be diced up here. And then you just have your little bit at the end. Compost. Onions diced up. Basically, we just want to get everything prepped and ready for the skillet here. Jalapeno, optional. I think it really doesn't add too much heat, but adds a whole lot of flavor. So if you're afraid of the heat, don't be afraid of the jalapenos. If you get most of the seeds out, a lot of that spice does go away. So I'm going to take a couple cloves of garlic here, and this jalapeno, we're going to dice it down. Probably about 2 cloves of garlic, maybe 3. Not a whole lot, just adding some of the flavor there. These are a little small, a little wonky, but looks like we got 2.5 cloves here. Should be about right for what we're going for today. So with the garlic, good way to get at it is take your knife, hold it sideways here, and just press on the garlic. And from there, the skin kind of falls off, and there's sometimes little garlic cloves within the cloves, so you sometimes need to repress them. And that makes the skin a lot easier to kind of just peel off from there. Compost your skin. You can also just buy garlic that's already minced, or garlic that's already been skinned. Whew. Good catch, Amber. Caught the kitty falling off the chair. We have a new addition to the household, so you might hear excess background noise. That is our 6-month-old kitty. He is a dragon and a demon. But I love him. You want to keep them separate because we're going to add the onion first and then the garlic and jalapeno together. So jalapeno, feel free to rinse that off. Jalapenos, you want to be pretty careful handling these because the seeds are very spicy, so you'll get some of the oils and stuff on your fingers and hands, and you want to make sure you don't touch your face, touch your private areas, touch other people's private areas. You want to be careful with your jalapenos here. You can kind of cut it in half, but lately what I've been doing is kind of just approaching it from the bottom here and just doing little like slits up in here just to try and preserve as much of the jalapeno itself while getting this base out. So I'm really sort of just stabbing up through it. But you want to be careful. You don't want to go through because then you're going to, your hand's on the other side. So just up there through a little bit, and then you kind of have this butt right here, which you can kind of just pull out and you get most of the seeds there. And from there, I'll cut it in half. And then this is where you sort of get the spiciness out of the jalapeno. So there's all these seeds here. I'm going to take a spoon and I'm going to scrape out all the seeds and this little skin on the inside, and that'll get rid of most of the heat. So take the spoon and you can kind of just scrape down through it, and most of the seeds fall out, that inner skin falls out, and you got a nice clean pepper there. And it really shouldn't be all that spicy, especially when you cook it down. Jalapenos there, we just took out the seeds. Wash your hands. Even before you cut it, you might want to wash your hands multiple times throughout this process, just to make sure you don't accidentally burn yourself. Because if you get it in your eyes, it's going to sting for a good while. It's going to be pretty uncomfortable for, 20-30 minutes or so. So get a nice lather. We're all COVID safe here, so we should be pretty comfortable washing our hands for the 20 seconds, getting underneath the fingernails and all that stuff. Pepper here, we're just going to make strips and then cut it along the side there, and so you're just left with little squares, similar size to your garlic here. So you just make your strips, turn it sideways, and just cut it there against the strip, and yeah, just little pieces like that. Perfect. And we're going to set that aside with the garlic because we're going to be adding both those together. Jalapeno, cut, wash your hands. Skillet is hot. You can always take a little bit of water, throw it on top. You see the sizzle. We're ready to add the onions here. I use a cast iron skillet. You could also use any sort of like pan, any sort of non-stick pan also works. I just happen to like using the cast iron, something I'm pretty comfortable and used to. But if you don't have a cast iron, don't worry about it. So just add the onions there and stir them around a little bit just so they kind of submerge themselves in all the oil. And I like using lids when I cook, so we're just going to kind of leave the lid on for now. After a couple minutes, we're going to add the garlic and jalapeno, and then ultimately the tofu. So tofu, we have an open bag here. There's a lot of water in this bag, so I make a cut here, and then I drain all the water and grab the tofu out from there. Along the top here, and down the side here. And I'm using tofu today, but again, you can use any sort of ground meat you'd like. You can cook it down in the same spot, in the same order that I'm doing the tofu here, and it should work out for you A-okay. So we have the water out of there. We got our big slab of tofu here. This is a big slab. I don't want to use this whole thing. Probably going to use about 2/3 because this is sort of the substitute for ground meat. So I want it to act as a hearty base to this entire nacho dish here. Tofu is easy to cut. We have our extra slab here, which we're going to put in a Tupperware. Slab of tofu here. There's a lot of water in it, so basically what we want to do is take some paper towels, probably about 2 or 3, and just fold them up and put the tofu inside of it and wrap the paper towel around. You can then leave a cutting board or anything heavy on top of it, or you can use your hands. If you use your hands, you want to kind of make sure you keep the shape of the tofu. You don't want to break it apart too much. You just kind of want to squeeze it out and squeeze out all the water that you can. So, squeeze out a good amount of that moisture. You can see the paper towel completely soaked here. and that is what we want. We don't want the onions to brown too much, so I'm going to check back in here. You can see that they're already starting to brown a bit. Probably also due to a little bit of a dirty skillet, but onions are looking pretty translucent, so we're going to go ahead and add the jalapenos and garlic, and you can also add a little salt and pepper here as well. Not a ton. Mostly want to save a lot of that salt and pepper and the seasoning generally for the tofu. Tofu is kind of like a blank slate. You sort of add whatever flavors you want to it, and the tofu will then absorb it. So we can spread it around here. Just make sure it's nice and distributed, covered in all the oil. Add the lid. Only going to cook down for just a couple moments here, and so we can turn our focus back to the tofu. I'm actually going to mostly just break the tofu up in my hands today, so not a lot of cutting required. I'm just going to take this block here and just cut it into fours here. And when the time comes, I'm basically just going to hold it over the skillet and break it apart in my hand. So other things that we can do to kind of expedite this process, butter, I'm going to use this for eggs. I'm just going to scramble down some eggs and throw them on top at the end. So basically, I'm just going to cut out a little bit of butter for the eggs and put that in the pan, and then I'll just sit in the pan until I need it. But again, just sort of ways to prepare yourself for what's coming ahead and to be able to get stuff out of your way here. Next thing we want to get ready, this we're going to check on in just a moment here. This pepper, we want to saute it after the tofu, kind of just towards the end, just so it stays with a lot of structure. It just cooks down a little bit of sweetness. We're going to add it after the tofu, but we might as well get it prepared. Since the red pepper is going to sort of accent the dish, we aren't going to use too much, probably just about half of it. Cooking for about 2 people today, probably going to have a little bit of leftovers afterwards as well. So we want to get the inside seeds out, the inside skin out, just like we did with the jalapeno. And from here, you can just take it and cut strips along like this. I would say kind of a medium width. You don't want them super skinny, but you don't want them super fat either, because you want them to cook down pretty quickly, but also have some structure to them. So we got them cut down in strips, and again, just like the jalapeno, just sort of go across the strips, and you'll be left with the little chunks. And that is going to be going in after the tofu. Let's check back in on the saute here. So things are starting to get close to browning a little bit here. So we probably want to add the tofu. You can smell the garlic. You can see the jalapenos start to change color, starting to look a little lighter there. So with this tofu here, I have the blocks here, and basically you just want to make it into some sort of ground meat, some fake ground meat, you know? So just hold it in your hand and just kind of smush into it. And it's a little weird, but we'll stir it around in a second, it'll be fine. And also shows the importance of having clean hands. Make sure you're washing while you're cooking, before you cook, just to make sure you're not adding a lot of dirt and germs to your food here. So yeah, you can just kind of smush it. It just kind of turns into like a cottage cheese almost, you know. But this is going to be our ground meat for the dish. And it works as a pretty good substitute. We're going to season it up a little bit and cook it down. And when all is said and done, flavor-wise, texture-wise, nacho-wise, it's going to be delicious. Alright, so we got that all broken up. Salt and pepper, pretty good amount. This is where we're going to start adding a lot of the flavor to this dish here. We're also going to add a good amount of olive oil as well. Tofu will absorb a lot of olive oil. You don't want this stuff to start browning too early. You want to make sure you have time to cook it down. So we're going to add a good amount of olive oil here and stir everything around and put that lid back on. And then soon we'll be going chili powder, cook that down a bit, add some cumin, cook that down a bit, this smoked paprika really just as a garnish that we'll add at the very end of everything. Last thing I'm gonna need to chop here is cheese. I don't have a good cheese grater, so I just chop it up. And it's a little more tedious, but I don't like buying pre-shredded cheese. A lot of times they have like anti-caking agents and weird preservatives that I'm kind of just afraid of, to be honest with you. So I have a little bit of Smokey cheddar here, and I really like this with the nachos. It gives it kind of almost like a meaty, bacony kind of flavor and notes throughout. It also kind of just enhances sort of the cumin and the chili and just kind of gives it more of a, you know, Mexican cuisine kind of vibe to it all. So a little bit of Smokey cheddar here. It's very strong, and I don't want to use a ton of it. So basically I'm just going to cut it with some regular cheddar here that I have. So a little bit of Smokey cheddar, a little bit of regular cheddar. This is where you can sort of add more cheese or less cheese depending on if you're, you know, dairy-free or looking to make it just cheesy and delicious or trying to make it a little more healthy. This is definitely one of the places in this dish that you can avoid as much cheese as I'm about to add. But I like me some cheese and some cheesy nachos, so I'm gonna go for it. Alright, cheese, we kind of have these big chunks. I want it a little smaller. I mean, you don't need to replicate shredded cheese because ultimately the cheese is going to melt a whole lot, so you want to be able to distribute it. You don't need to get too carried away with how finely you cut this cheese up. So that is a good amount of cheese. I don't need to add too much of the cheddar here, but I do want to add a little bit just because this is going to be about 2 to 3 servings, if not more, and we're looking to start off our day with a nice hearty breakfast nachos here. So the tofu we do want to brown a little bit, so we can leave it without stirring it too much, but I do want to check in on it just to make sure it doesn't burn. So got a little bit of brown happening underneath here. As you kind of flip it over from the other side, you can see that instead of white, it's looking a little browner, which is a good sign. Once it gets slightly more brown, we're going to be adding that chili powder. Don't want to add it too much because then it'll kind of cook down for too long and the flavors will get really lost. So you want to sort of cook everything down in its natural flavors and juices for a while, and then you can start adding some of the seasoning there. So flip that over. You can see this side is still quite white, so we want to cook it down a little bit more, and then we'll add some chili powder to it. Back to the cheese here. Just cleaning up the cheese, cutting it down. Again, if you have shredded cheese, use it. If you have a cheese shredder, use it. I don't, so this is what I do. Again, kind of chunks that are a little too big here. Move this out of the way for safety, and we'll just kind of keep going across. Alright, and we'll probably leave it about there. So that's all the chopping I need to do. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this knife and put it away. Everything's prepped. Last thing we really need to do is to crack the eggs and stir those up for some scrambled eggs. Did want to check back in on the tofu here just to make sure not too much time goes by without us keeping an eye on it. So, starting to brown a little bit. Not a worry. That's what we're ultimately hoping for. And I think this is probably a good time to add some of the chili powder here. So we want to do a pretty liberal amount just to kind of cover everything here. It's not the spiciest chili powder in the world, so don't worry about adding the heat there. But a good liberal amount to cover everything. And then from there, feel free to just stir it back in. And we'll give that a few minutes, and we'll add the cumin in with the peppers. And when we do that, we're actually going to add some veggie broth. Veggie broth is something that I've been using a lot lately to cook down with some veggies. Also with my tofu, it seems to add a lot of liquid to the situation and flavor as well that helps it keep its structure while also providing a lot of flavor. So with tofu, you're able to cook it down a lot, adds a lot of flavor in there. Things like asparagus, things that kind of lose its structure very quickly. If you add some vegetable broth into your pan while you're sauteing it, it actually helps keep the structure of the asparagus a lot more fuller and also cooks it down with a lot more flavor. So veggie broth, kind of a little secret ingredient I've been using a lot with my cooking lately. Since I am using the Pyrex oven today, gotta turn the oven on. probably about 250. Really, we're just trying to melt some cheese. You don't want the chips to dry out too much, so you don't want to put it on anything that's going to be too high, that's going to like add too much heat to everything. We really just want to melt the cheese down a little bit. Checking back in on the saute here. Looking pretty oily. Looking nice and colorful seasoning. You see how the tofu itself is starting to brown and kind of look like some sort of fake meat that you might add to something. And that's ultimately what I'm going for with my vegetarian diet, but you could also be using actual animal protein here in a very similar fashion. So we got nice browning there. That's looking pretty dang close. So let's add our peppers here. Maybe hit those with a tiny bit of salt, tiny bit of pepper. Just to bring out some of those flavors. And ultimately what we're going to do is take some of this veggie broth, shake it up, and add some. And we really just want to add enough to sort of cover the bottom so you see the steam come up, but ultimately you don't want to add too much because you want to be able to cook all of the veggie broth off. If you add too much, you might end up with a very liquidy saute later, which you don't want to deal with. So you can always add more as you go, but you don't want to start off with too much or else you might find yourself in a little bit of trouble. So a little bit there. You see it kind of fills out around the edge, and as we stir things up, we'll kind of get a better idea as to how much we added and as to if it's enough. Because you want it to be a little soupy right now, and then, over the next couple minutes, it'll all cook off. Those peppers will get nice and soft while still being very sweet and still holding their structure a little bit. So after stirring that around, it's not super soupy. I'm actually going to add a tiny bit more because this is going to cook off. Also, it's going to add a lot of flavor. So we're just going to add a little bit more there. Just going to crack some eggs. Most of you are probably pretty familiar, but a lot of it is just confidence in hitting it hard but not smashing it on the countertop. If you've worked in food service, you've probably just obliterated an egg on top of a countertop before. Shit happens. It's all good. And if you're curious as about eggs and egg health and all that kind of stuff, if you see dark yolks throughout your eggs, like that one's quite a bit darker than that one, usually shows that the chicken itself is a little bit healthier, had a little bit more nutrients, and probably a better life overall. I don't want to get too political about it, but a lot of the buzzwords you see around eggs nowadays are quite misleading. Things like cage-free, for example, doesn't quite represent the lifestyle that you might think these chickens have. A lot of times cage-free is just as bad as any sort of industrial system. So if you can, try and find pasture-raised. Pasture-raised usually alludes to the fact that they had land to roam around on. Cage-free really just says we took them out of the cages that they were once in, but they don't really have much more room themselves. So we got a couple yolks here. Gonna add a little bit of pepper. Sometimes people add like cream and stuff to their eggs. I don't really care so much for that, so I'm not gonna do it. Whisk, fork, whatever. But kind of hold it at an angle, and then you're kind of like scooping through, as opposed to like a back and forth or an around. You just kind of scoop through in sort of these like circular motions. And make sure you're composting your eggshells full of calcium. Really good for soils. As is compost generally. Okay, whisk them. You don't want to whisk them too much. Those are whisked. We're going to put them off to the side. That's going to be the last thing we cook. Really, we're just trying to prepare everything because this is almost done. All right. Checking back in on this. We see it's bubbling up a little bit. That's a good sign. We want all that stuff to cook down, all those flavors to mold together in a yummy fashion. Still a little soupy. So what I might end up doing is just cracking this lid a little bit so it's not fully on, but leaves a little bit of room so some of that moisture can escape there, but you're still kind of keeping in a lot of that heat there. So what I want to do is prepare this Pyrex here. Bago chips. And you want a nice base to it. So we're going to have a good amount of nachos there. Spread those out. Maybe a couple more. We're going to make it cheesy, so you don't want too much of that cheese stuck to that Pyrex. I want all that cheese on the chips, right? So I want to make sure that the bottom surface area is really covered here. Boom, love it. Cheese. Basically, we've got Smokey cheddar here, regular cheddar here. Let's blend it, Let's blend it up. Even mix and match here. And I'm going to do a couple layers on these nachos. So I'm actually going to use most of the cheese, but not all of it here. Leave a good amount for that second layer. And when we go here, I know it's kind of chunky crumbles, but again, that's why we're melting it down. Everything will distribute, and you can see quite a good amount of cheese. Seems like most of the chips have their own little cubes here, which is what we want. Want everyone to get a little taste of that good smoky cheddar goodness. Next thing, once this is done, we're going to pour this on top, add another layer of chips, add another layer of cheese, and then we're going to put it in the oven. And then we're going to start cooking our eggs. Pretty close to done here. You can see, still a little soupy. And at that point, we want to add some cumin here. Kind of a last minute addition. Don't want to cook the cumin down too long, or else it'll kind of get lost. But if you sort of cook it down towards the end, you get a lot of that flavor to really pop. And so after you add a pretty liberal amount of cumin, feel free to stir that in. A lot of that soupiness, a lot of that water, that liquid is basically gone here. So we are very close to being finished and enjoying ourselves some of these delicious nachos. Tofu doesn't really have a set in stone cook time. It's not like meat where you have to sort of get the inside to a certain temperature. Basically, we're waiting for these peppers to get softer, and so you can feel free to try one and see where everything's at. Still a little crunchy. A little bit more crunchy than we want. Pretty close though, so I'm basically just gonna put this lid back on, capture some of that heat, and then those peppers will soften up, and then we can add it on top of our nachos. All right, peppers are right where we want them. Pretty soft, the slightest bit of structure, a lot of tangy sweetness to it. So we're gonna go ahead and put them on top of the nachos here. It's not gonna take too long in the oven, so basically I'm gonna get the eggs ready as well while I do this. Scrambled eggs, you don't want them too hot. Mediums here, probably about 1 or 2 notches below medium. This is also the point that, like, if you're using like a bowl in a microwave kind of situation, you don't necessarily have to add all of the insides to it. You can just sort of add what you need and put the rest in a Tupperware, and then later you can come back and reheat the insides and make the same nacho dish over again. All right, so shake it, get it all loose. And we're gonna do 2 layers, so I want most of it on this layer, but not all of it on this layer. And you can kind of just put it in your spatula and just kind of shake it around a little bit. I'm basically just trying to avoid dumping it all into one spot because the nachos and cheese are sort of already in place, and it might be a little hard to distribute the tofu and the peppers and stuff. So just kind of shake it around, spread it around, get love to all the different chips, all the different corners of everything here. All right, and that is layer number 1. So we want to go back with more chips. Boop. Boop. More chips. Yeah. And so at the end of the day, we use almost a full bag of chips. There's probably about a third of it left. This isn't necessarily the healthiest breakfast, but you know, you don't have to use the butter. Tofu makes it a lot healthier. You don't have to add as much cheese. There's different ways to kind of mix and match and make this a little bit healthier. Chips, add the last bit of cheese we got cut up over there. Again, trying to get that distribution as far and wide as possible. And it's not going to be quite the cheesy layer that the bottom one was, and that is very okay. If it were that much cheese, that'd probably be too much cheese. I'm not trying to eat that much cheese in the morning. I'm too old for that level of lactose, you know? Body doesn't work the same way it used to. And not a whole lot of innards left, but we'll just kind of take this and just kind of shuffle it around a little bit just to kind of top it off. And this one I can kind of hold the pan to the side because I'm not too worried about everything falling into it. So it's really about the heart of it, the inside there. And that's looking good. Oven's ready, so basically we're going to put this in the oven for just a few moments. We really just want to melt that cheese. Butter here, nice and melted down. We can add our scrambled eggs now. Again, you don't want to over whisk them. That'll be fine. Just get all that going there. And then basically once you see that the edges are starting to cook, that's when we'll start pulling the eggs towards the middle here. But just feel free to let everything sit for the moment. Eggs, you can see they're starting to cook on the inside, so basically, or on the outside. So you want to just take this outside and pull them towards the middle here. And that means that the egg that still needs to be cooked will move towards the outside. And then it'll just lead to a more even scramble throughout. So you see that all the cooked stuff is now on the inside, and then that outside stuff is all the new stuff that needs to be cooked, which will be shortly. And just because we needed to melt the cheese, let's go check back in on our nachos here. And a little bit longer, just a little bit. You can see this cheese still has a little bit of structure. I just want it a little bit more melted, so we're just gonna leave it a couple more minutes. Back to the eggs here, you see the outsides are gonna cook. So again, start pulling that towards the inside, and you can kind of start folding it in on itself and kind of moving everything around. And pull the cooked stuff towards the inside, let the less cooked stuff reach the outside. And yep. So yeah, keep scrambling around. You can kind of poke into them and make sure there's no pockets, because sometimes some parts will be more liquidy, and like this is really cooked, that's really liquidy. So you just want to kind of make sure everything's distributed, moved around, all that surface area is being covered, and you get a nice even scramble. And eggs, like many proteins, will continue to cook after you take them off the heat. So basically you don't want to get to the point where they're done and then you turn the heat off if they're just sitting there. We're going to turn the heat off slightly before they're done. So I want to take all that moisture and extra liquid out of my eggs. I don't really like runny eggs, so we got most of that moisture and stuff out there. Everything's looking pretty nice and scrambled, and then from there we can just turn the heat off. That's going to continue to cook a little bit, but it also just buys us time while the cheese is melting. Nachos should be ready here. Might have to use 2 hands to get it out and make sure it's secure. It'd be a very sad day if we were to drop all of our breakfast nachos on the ground. So I am making sort of more breakfast nachos here with the eggs. Super optional, you know, this is gonna be a very hearty nacho dish if you kept it like this and ate it for dinner or lunch or really whatever. I like eggs in the morning, so we're just gonna take these eggs here and just kind of top them off. Again, you kind of want it to distribute around because it's not super easy to move the nachos at this point. You kind of want to just get a little bit in every bite here. And that's kind of your top little layer. You got your little scrambled egg blanket on top. Super yummy. If you want to add a little bit more flavor to it, a little bit more smokiness to it, some smoked paprika, you can kind of just shake it all over the top here. Brings out some color, brings out some flavor. Nice little addition. Make sure your oven's off, make sure your surfaces are off. Let's go eat some nachos.